Welcome to Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg. This deep dive is generated with AI, but all the content has been fact-checked by Bastian Freiburg himself. So,
Mhm.
you're getting the real deal. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into city diplomacy,
Okay.
and specifically how local governments can play a surprisingly powerful role in international relations, particularly when it comes to conflict prevention and peace building.
Right.
You might be thinking, wait, isn't that the job of national governments in the UN?
Yeah.
Well,
It's a good question.
yeah, it is a good question. And as we'll see in this deep dive, the answer is much more complicated and fascinating than you might expect.
Yeah, it's an area that's often overlooked, but cities have this huge potential when it comes to creating
Yes,
peace. They've
so.
got a totally different grasp of, the local needs and the kind of dynamics that are at play than national governments or international organizations.
Right, exactly. You would think it would be solely the responsibility of nation states and the UN to deal with these kinds of conflicts.
Hmm.
But as we're going to see, that's not the whole picture.
No, they can act independently.
Right.
Cities can. And they can also act in cooperation with each other to promote peace. And they can use their resources, their networks, and their expertise to influence the international scene in a way that's often more agile and responsive than traditional diplomatic channels.
Okay, so let's start by defining city diplomacy,
Okay.
because maybe that's not a term that everybody's familiar with.
Well, simply put, is any action taken by local governments that affects peace or conflict, whether it's intentional or unintentional.
Uh-huh.
It can be anything from twin city partnerships to humanitarian aid to political lobbying.
So it's a pretty wide spectrum of activities.
Yeah, it's broad. It really is. And the interesting thing is that cities have been engaged in these sorts of activities for over a century.
Wow.
But it's only recently that international and national actors have really started to see the potential.
Why do you think there's been that change?
Well, there are several reasons for that. Firstly, globalization has meant that cities are more interconnected and interdependent.
Right.
Secondly, conflicts are increasingly having an urban dimension where cities are often on the front line.
Yeah.
And thirdly, there's been a growing realization that peace building needs to happen from the bottom up, that local actors need to have a central role.
That makes a lot of sense. But what specifically makes cities so well suited to engaging in peace building?
They have this unique combination of technical and political expertise that is really invaluable in peace building.
Okay.
They understand local needs, they can provide essential services, and they can build trust between communities.
Can you give me an example of how that looks in practice?
Yeah, take Nicaragua in the 1980s.
Okay.
Dutch cities challenged U.S. foreign policy by forming these twinning relationships with Nicaraguan municipalities.
Wow.
And these partnerships focused on local democracy, municipal policy, and concrete projects in areas like housing, education, and healthcare.
That's pretty brave to go up against a superpower like the U.S.
It was.
Were there other examples of cities that challenged national government policies?
Yeah, in South Africa around the same time, Dutch cities were campaigning against apartheid. They engaged in cultural and economic boycotts, awareness-raising activities, and support for resistance movements.
So in those cases, cities were directly challenging national government policy.
Yeah, they were.
That must have taken a lot of commitment from the local authorities and citizens.
Absolutely. And that's one of the most important preconditions for city diplomacy to succeed. There needs to be genuine commitment from local leaders.
Besides commitment, what else is crucial for city diplomacy to work?
A stable security environment is another really important factor.
Yeah.
It's difficult to build peace if there's constant violence and instability. And then it's also really important that there's a legal framework in place
Okay.
that empowers local governments and gives them the authority to act.
So it's not just about having good intentions,
Yeah.
but about having the right structures in place as well. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah.
The legal frameworks?
Yeah, so in a lot of countries, local authorities are constrained by national laws and regulations.
Okay.
For example, they may not be allowed to sign agreements with foreign cities, or they might not have control over the resources that are necessary to implement peace-building projects.
That makes sense. So there are both internal and external factors at play when it comes to city diplomacy.
Yes.
Now, we've talked a lot about examples from the 1980s.
Right.
Do you have an example from a more recent conflict?
Yeah. During the Bosnian War in the 1990s, cities across Europe lobbied for peace, and they provided humanitarian aid.
Okay.
The Council of Europe launched this program called Agencies for Local Democracy, which enabled European cities to support offices in cities like Subotica, Osijek, and Tuzla that were working for peace and democracy.
So city diplomacy isn't just about bilateral connections, but can also operate at a regional and international level.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you tell me more about that Agencies for Local Democracy program?
Yeah, it was a groundbreaking initiative that allowed European cities to share their expertise and resources with cities in Bosnia that were really badly affected by the war.
Right.
It focused on strengthening local democracy, promoting dialogue between different ethnic groups, and supporting the rebuilding of society.
It's impressive to see how cities can cooperate to strengthen peace efforts and support each other in difficult times.
Yeah.
But I imagine it's not always easy to navigate in a post-conflict environment where there's often mistrust and trauma.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
Post-conflict environments are often very complex and fragile. There are lots of different actors with different interests.
Right.
And there is a risk that peace-building initiatives can actually exacerbate the conflict if they're not implemented with a deep understanding of the local context.
That sounds like an important point.
Yeah.
How can you make sure that you don't unintentionally make the situation worse?
It's crucial to have a nuanced approach and avoid imposing solutions from the outside.
Okay.
It's about listening to local actors and understanding their needs and their concerns.
Sounds like humility is needed when you're working with city diplomacy in post-conflict environments.
Absolutely. It's not about coming in with all the answers. It's about facilitating a process
Yeah.
where local actors can find their own solutions.
That makes a lot of sense. Can you give me an example of how cities have contributed to peace building in a post-conflict environment?
Yeah, after the war in Yugoslavia, cities like Osijek took the lead in rebuilding trust and promoting cooperation between different ethnic groups. They understood that lasting peace requires reconciliation and coexistence at the local level.
That's an inspiring example.
It is.
It must have been a long and demanding process.
Yeah, it takes time and persistence to rebuild trust and create reconciliation, but Osijek is a good example that it can be done.
Now, that's an example from Europe. Do you have any examples of city diplomacy in other parts of the world?
Yeah, in Colombia, local governments in the Cauca region are facing threats from illegal armed groups.
Wow.
They've partnered with European cities for political support and tangible cooperation, and that international attention has really helped to protect their peace-building efforts.
So city diplomacy can help to strengthen the security and protection of local authorities and civil society in conflict zones.
Yes.
Do you have any other examples of city diplomacy that has had a positive effect on the security situation in a conflict zone?
Yeah, in the Middle East, we have the Municipal Alliance for Peace, MAP, which has brought together Israeli and Palestinian municipalities.
Okay.
And despite the challenges that obviously exist, this initiative has fostered dialogue and project collaboration, which shows the potential for city diplomacy even in highly contested areas.
That is an inspiring example of how city diplomacy can create space for dialogue and cooperation, even in the most intractable conflicts. But it must also be one of the most challenging areas to work in.
Yeah, absolutely. The conflict between Israel and Palestine is very complex and deep-rooted, but MAP is proof that dialogue and cooperation are possible even in the most difficult situations. And that's what city diplomacy is all about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Building bridges between people and communities that are otherwise divided by conflict.
That's a beautiful thought. But we've been talking quite a bit about the positive aspects of city diplomacy.
Right.
Are there also potential pitfalls that we need to be aware of?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. City diplomacy is not a magic bullet. And there is a risk that it could actually exacerbate conflicts if it's not implemented properly.
Okay.
I think one of the biggest challenges is that cities often lack the resources they need to engage in city diplomacy.
Okay.
We talked earlier about financial resources,
Right.
but it's also often a lack of personnel with the right expertise.
That's an important point. It's not enough to have good intentions.
Yeah.
You also need to have the practical means to act. What can be done to address that challenge?
Well, there are several things that can be done. Firstly, it's important that national governments and international organizations support cities' efforts. This can be through funding,
Right.
training, capacity building. Secondly, cities can cooperate with each other and share resources and expertise. And thirdly, cities can engage in fundraising and seek support from private foundations and businesses.
Those sound like good solutions.
Yeah.
Are there other pitfalls that we need to be aware of?
Yeah. Another challenge is that city diplomacy can be difficult to coordinate.
Got it.
There are lots of different actors involved,
Right.
local, national, international.
Yeah.
And it can be tough to ensure that everybody's working in the same direction. This can lead to inefficiency, duplication of effort,
Yeah.
and in the worst case, to different initiatives actually working against each other.
That's a classic challenge when you have many different actors collaborating.
Yeah.
How can we ensure better coordination in city diplomacy contexts?
Well, it's important to establish clear communication channels between the different actors. Secondly, it's important to develop shared goals and strategies. And thirdly, it's important to have a system for monitoring and evaluation so that you can learn from your experiences and adjust your approach along the way.
Those sound like sensible measures.
Yeah.
Any other pitfalls we should be aware of?
Well, a third challenge is that city diplomacy can be vulnerable to political changes.
Right.
So, for example, a change in national government policy can lead to a city's city diplomacy initiatives losing support. Or a change in the local political leadership can lead to a decline in the city's commitment to city diplomacy.
Well, that's a risk you always run when you're working with politics.
Yeah.
Is there anything that can be done to minimize that risk?
Yeah, it's important to try and anchor the city's city diplomacy engagement in a broad political majority.
Okay.
For example, you can involve all the relevant political parties in the decision-making process. You can also try to build broad public support for the city's city diplomacy initiatives.
That's a good way to ensure that the city's engagement in city diplomacy isn't dependent on individual politicians or parties. Are there any other things that can be done to strengthen the sustainability of city diplomacy?
Yes, it's important to integrate city diplomacy into the city's overall strategy and planning.
Oh.
For example, you can develop a city diplomacy strategy which outlines the city's goals, priorities, and approach to city diplomacy.
Right.
You can also integrate city diplomacy into the city's budget and allocate the necessary resources to implement the strategy.
That sounds like a sensible approach.
Yeah.
And we talked quite a bit about the challenges associated with city diplomacy.
Yeah.
But let's get back to the positive aspects.
Okay.
Can you give me a specific example of how city diplomacy has helped to resolve a conflict?
Yeah. In Croatia, the city of Osijek played a crucial role in peacebuilding after the war in Yugoslavia.
Right.
Osijek was a multi-ethnic city that was hit hard by the war. The city had been divided into a Croatian part and a Serbian part. And there was a lot of distrust and animosity between the two groups. After the war, Osijek's mayor took the initiative to rebuild trust and cooperation between the two groups. He established a forum for dialogue between representatives from the two groups.
Yeah.
And he launched a number of projects to promote cooperation and reconciliation. For example, he established a joint cultural center and a joint sports center for Croatian and Serbian children.
That's an inspiring example of how city diplomacy can help to heal wounds and create a shared future after conflict. But it must have taken a lot of courage and a strong vision from the mayor.
Yeah, it takes a special kind of leadership to engage in city diplomacy in post-conflict environments.
Right.
You have to be willing to take risks and go against the grain. You also have to have a strong belief that dialogue and cooperation are possible even in the most difficult situations.
Now that's an inspiring thought. But we've been talking a lot about the political and strategic aspects of city diplomacy.
Yeah.
Let's turn our attention to the more practical aspects. Can you give me an example of a concrete project that has been realized through city diplomacy?
Yeah, in Nicaragua, Dutch cities, in cooperation with Nicaraguan municipalities, have implemented a number of projects in areas such as housing, education, and healthcare.
Okay.
For example, they've built new homes for families who lost their homes during the war. They've also renovated schools and hospitals and trained teachers and healthcare workers.
That's a good example of how city diplomacy is not just about symbolic politics,
No, it's not.
but about making concrete improvements in people's lives.
Absolutely.
Do you have other examples of projects that have had a positive impact on people's living conditions?
Yeah, in South Africa, Dutch cities have supported a number of projects aimed at tackling poverty and inequality.
Okay.
For example, they've supported the establishment of microcredit schemes, which have enabled poor families to start their own businesses. They've also supported educational programs for young people who have dropped out of school.
Wow, those are fantastic examples of how city diplomacy can help to create a more just and sustainable world. But it must also take a lot of commitment and a long-term effort.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
City diplomacy is not a quick fix. It takes time, patience, and persistence to create sustainable solutions. But the rewards are great, both for the cities involved and for the world as a whole.
That's a very inspiring thought to end on. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today.
It was a pleasure.
Really fascinating stuff.
And that's what makes city diplomacy so exciting. You know, it's not just about dealing with crises. It's about creating a foundation for a more peaceful and just society.
Right.
And cities can play a really crucial role in that.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see that cities aren't just passive bystanders to global events,
Yeah.
but that they can actively shape and influence the world we live in.
Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned earlier, there are also potential pitfalls to city diplomacy.
Yeah.
We've already talked about resources and coordination. Are
Right.
there other things that we need to be aware of? Yeah, I think one of the things that is often overlooked is the importance of implementing city diplomacy with a deep understanding of the local context.
Okay.
It's important to avoid imposing solutions from the outside,
Right.
but instead to listen to the local actors and understand their needs and their concerns.
That makes a lot of sense. You can easily imagine a project that works really well in one context
Yeah.
might have unintended negative consequences in another context.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have a nuanced approach to city diplomacy and to avoid seeing it as a one-size-fits-all solution.
Are there any specific tools or methods that can be used to ensure that city diplomacy is implemented in a way that is sensitive to the local context?
Yeah, there are a number of tools that can be helpful.
Yeah.
One of them is Peace and Conflict Impact Assessment, PCIA, which is a tool that can be used to identify the potential peace and conflict impacts of an initiative,
Okay.
both positive and negative.
That sounds like an invaluable tool for navigating the complex dynamics in conflict zones.
It is.
Can you elaborate a bit on how PCIA works in practice?
Yeah, PCIA is a systematic process.
Okay.
It involves a number of steps, including identifying the relevant actors,
Right.
analyzing the conflict dynamics, assessing the potential positive and negative impacts of the initiative, and developing strategies to minimize the negative impacts and maximize the positive impacts.
That sounds like a very thorough process.
Yeah.
Who typically uses PCIA?
PCIA can be used by a wide range of actors,
Okay.
including local authorities, national governments, international organizations, and NGOs.
So it's a good example of how city diplomacy isn't an isolated phenomena,
Right.
but that it often involves cooperation between a number of different actors.
Exactly, and that's one of the strengths of city diplomacy, that it can build bridges between different actors and levels, and in doing so, contribute to a more coordinated and effective effort for peace.
But even with the best planning and the best intentions, it can happen that city diplomacy doesn't succeed.
Yeah.
What are some of the most common reasons why city diplomacy initiatives fail?
Well, there can be many reasons why city diplomacy initiatives fail.
Right.
One of the most common reasons is a lack of resources.
Yeah.
Like we talked about earlier, this can be financial resources, but it can also be a lack of personnel with the right expertise.
It is crucial to have the necessary resources available if you're going to realize your ambitions.
Absolutely. Another common reason why city diplomacy initiatives fail is a lack of coordination.
Okay.
If there isn't a clear division of labor and an effective cooperation between the different actors, this can lead to inefficiency, duplication of effort, and in a worst-case scenario, to different initiatives actually working against each other.
That's a classic challenge in many types of collaboration.
Yeah, it is.
How can you ensure better coordination in city diplomacy context?
Well, it's important to establish clear communication channels between the different actors.
Yeah.
It's also important to develop shared goals and strategies. And finally, it's important to have a system for monitoring and evaluation so that you can learn from your experiences and adjust your approach along the way.
Those sound like very good pieces of advice.
Yeah.
Are there any other reasons why city diplomacy initiatives might fail?
Well, a third common reason is that city diplomacy initiatives can be vulnerable to political changes.
Right.
So, for example, a change in national government policy can lead to a city's city diplomacy initiatives losing support, or a change in local political leadership can lead to a decline in the city's commitment to city diplomacy.
That's a factor that can be hard to control.
Yeah, it is.
Is there anything you can do to minimize that risk?
Yeah, it's important to try and anchor the city's city diplomacy engagement in a broad political majority.
Okay.
You can do this, for example, by involving all the relevant political parties in the decision-making process.
Right.
You can also try and build broad public support for the city's city diplomacy initiatives.
That sounds like a sensible strategy.
Yeah.
But let's get back to the positive aspects of city diplomacy.
Okay.
Besides the examples we've already mentioned, what are some other areas where cities have been successful in engaging?
Well, cities have been successful in engaging in a wide range of areas, including climate change,
Okay.
migration, trade, and culture.
Wow.
For example, many cities have formed partnerships with each other to share knowledge and experiences on how to reduce CO2 emissions and adapt to climate change.
Okay.
Other cities have cooperated on integrating migrants and refugees into their communities.
Right.
And other cities have worked together to promote trade and investment between their regions.
That's a very broad spectrum of activities.
It is.
What makes cities particularly well-suited to engaging in those kinds of collaborations?
Well, cities have a number of advantages over national governments and international organizations.
Okay.
Firstly, cities are often more agile and flexible and can therefore respond more quickly to new challenges.
Right.
Secondly, cities are often closer to the citizens and have a better understanding of their needs and concerns.
Hmm.
And thirdly, cities often have a strong network of partners, both domestically and internationally.
That's a potent combination of strengths. But let's get back to what we started talking about. City diplomacy in conflict zones.
Okay.
Do you have an example of how city diplomacy has contributed to creating peace and reconciliation in a conflict zone where there's been a lot of distrust and animosity between different groups?
Yeah, in Northern Ireland, the city of Derry Londonderry played an important role in the peace process.
Okay.
The city was deeply divided between the Catholic and Protestant communities,
Right.
and there had been many years of violence and unrest. But in the 1990s, the city's leaders took the initiative to create a dialogue between the two groups.
Okay.
They established a number of forums where representatives from the two groups could meet and talk to each other.
Right.
They also launched a number of projects to promote cooperation and reconciliation.
Okay.
For example, they established a joint cultural center and a joint museum that would tell the history of the conflict from both sides' perspectives.
That's a powerful example that dialogue and cooperation are possible even in the most difficult situations. But it must have taken a lot of courage and a strong vision from the city's leaders.
Yeah, it takes a special kind of leadership to engage in city diplomacy in conflict zones.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to take risks and go against the grain. You also have to have a strong belief that dialogue and cooperation are possible even in the most difficult situations.
Now that's an inspiring thought.
Is.
But we've talked quite a bit about city diplomacy at a general level.
Yeah.
Let's dive a bit deeper into the details.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific activities cities can engage in when they're working with city diplomacy?
Well, cities can engage in a wide range of activities, including twin city partnerships.
Okay.
Cities can enter into twin city partnerships with cities in other countries to promote cultural exchange, economic cooperation, and political dialogue.
Right.
They can also participate in international networks. Cities can participate in international networks of cities that work on common challenges such as climate change, migration, and urban development. Humanitarian aid cities can provide humanitarian aid to cities in other countries that have been affected by disasters or conflicts. And political lobbying cities can lobby for their interests at the international level, for example, in climate negotiations or trade negotiations.
That's a wide range of activities.
It is.
How do cities typically choose which activities they want to engage in?
Well, that depends on a number of factors, including the city's resources, the city's interests, and the city's strategic priorities.
Right.
It's important that cities choose activities that are relevant for their local context and which they have the capacity to implement.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But let's go back to what we started talking about, city diplomacy in conflict zones.
Okay.
Can you give me an example of how a city has used one of the activities you just mentioned to contribute to peace building in a conflict zone?
Yeah, in Colombia, the city of Medellin has used twin city partnerships to promote peace building.
Okay.
Medellin was for many years plagued by violence and crime.
Wow.
But in the 1990s, the city embarked on an ambitious peace process.
Oh, okay.
As part of the peace process, Medellin entered into twin city partnerships with a number of cities in other countries,
Okay.
including Barcelona in Spain and Rotterdam in the Netherlands.
Wow.
Through these twin city partnerships, Medellin shared experiences on peace building with the other cities, and the other cities provided technical assistance and financial support to Medellin.
That's an inspiring example of how twin city partnerships can be used to promote peace building.
Yeah, it is.
But it must also require a lot of commitment from both Medellin and the other cities.
Yeah, twin city partnerships require a long-term commitment and a close collaboration between the cities involved. But if they are implemented correctly, they can be an effective tool for promoting peace building.
That's an optimistic note to end on.
It is.
Thanks for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today.
It was my pleasure.
It's really fascinating to see all the different ways that cities can work with peace building. It's such a different approach than the traditional diplomacy we often hear about.
Yeah. You know, city diplomacy is like a supplement to traditional diplomacy. It can reach into corners and create connections that states often have difficulty with.
And that's what makes it so exciting.
Yeah.
It's not just about negotiating peace agreements.
Yeah,
It's about making real change at the local level.
exactly. City diplomacy is about building bridges between people, promoting dialogue and cooperation,
Right.
and creating a foundation for a more peaceful and sustainable future.
And that's what makes city diplomacy so relevant to all of us.
Yeah.
Whether we live in a big city or a small village, we can all contribute to creating a more peaceful world.
Yeah, we can all support the cities that are engaging in city diplomacy, and we can all encourage our own cities to do more in this area.
That's a call to action that I'm happy to support.
Yeah.
City diplomacy is an important tool for creating a more peaceful and just world,
Yeah.
and it's a task that we all have a responsibility to support.
Thanks for listening. I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the exciting world of city diplomacy.
And remember, there's so much more to learn about city diplomacy. There's a wealth of resources available online and in libraries, and you can always contact your local municipality to find out more about how you can get involved in city diplomacy. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of diplomacy and international relations.